noson ze Stephanus,
In this episode, we're going to talk about Plato's works, mainly the dialogues attributed to Plato. And in context, this follows our episodes on Platonism in general, the evidence we have from ancient sources for Plato, and the ancient biographical traditions on Plato's life. And after this, we'll be talking more about a few of Plato's key ideas. The main source for knowing about Plato, just to review what we talked about before, is the dialogues attributed to Plato in antiquity. Of those dialogues, between 26 and 29 are generally accepted today as composed by Plato during a period of roughly 5 decades, between 399, the year that Socrates was executed, and 347. These constitute about 500,000 words in ancient Greek, usually quite a bit more in the canonical English translations, like the translations in the Cooper and Hutchinson volume you'll see on screen if you're watching on video, because Greek is a little bit more parsimonious than English, and incidentally, it's pretty easy to find lots of English translations for just a few Greek words. In most of the dialogues, Plato's teacher Socrates is a central character, usually the main speaking character, or as some scholars put it, like Melissa Lane, for example, Plato's apparent avatar or spokesperson. But it's a little different, as is often argued, from just calling him or the main character a spokesperson, because it's not totally clear whether Plato always means us to straightforwardly agree with whatever the main character seems to be saying. So in some ways, it's better to think of Plato like a playwright, like Shakespeare, who's staging a lot of characters, some of whom seem to be protagonists, some of whom seem to be antagonists, but it's sort of left open what the playwright themselves might think. In the same way, whatever people say in the dialogues, it's not necessarily obvious whether Plato himself would endorse any particular view. But still, in antiquity as today, a lot of readers of Plato are drawn to empathize with what Socrates says, and to think that whatever Socrates says that isn't refuted or changed in the course of a dialogue might represent what Plato himself was thinking when he wrote it to be true. But given this, it's still important to stress that Plato really rarely mentions himself. He does mention himself by name in the middle of the Apology, or Socrates' defense speech, and at the beginning of the Phaedo, mentioning that he wasn't present at the conversation that the dialogue purports to record. But these aren't really substantive mentions in a philosophical sense. He doesn't credit himself with any particular view, so it still remains quite open-ended and, in a very Socratic spirit, interrogative and ambiguous what Plato himself would endorse. The dialogues are available to us today mostly through the medieval manuscript tradition, that is, copies of copies of copies taken down by hand, mostly by monks and monastic practitioners through the European Middle Ages. We also have some material available in translation in other languages and corroborating evidence from ancient papyri and material sources, though compared to the main medieval manuscript tradition, these are scarce. But they do help us to have a bit of a control or perspective on the medieval transmission to say it's generally pretty solid and reliable. We also have a corpus of letters attributed to Plato in antiquity, as we mentioned in our episode on the evidence, and scholars are most prone to think that the 7th letter might be genuine, although there's debate about all of them, very nearly. The dialogues are an example of the burgeoning book trade in the ancient Mediterranean world in the 4th century BC. Plato himself mentions the book trade as substantial in Socrates' lifetime. Socrates is represented by Plato talking about how in his own youth in the earlier 5th century, the writing of Anaxagoras was influential for him. But by the 4th century, the spread was growing very quickly, and Plato was obviously a master of using this new medium to spread ideas and to draw students to his academy. The dialogue form itself was viewed by some contemporaries as a kind of unfamiliar literary genre, maybe comparable to mime. There's some relevant passages that touch on this in Aristotle's Poetics. Throughout these dialogues, as we call them, there's often very richly drawn and interesting characters. Sometimes they're just sketches, but often Plato goes into a lot of detail, from the frothing and angry sophist Thrasymachus in Book 1 of the Republic to curious and open-minded characters who are drawn to Socrates' example, for example, in the Symposium. But all these characters exchange question and answer almost invariably throughout the dialogue form in a process that would often be called dialectic by later authors. Aristotle, for example, uses this language of dialektike, which is really in Greek just from the same root as dialogue, conversation, to explain what Socrates was up to. And in a process of dialectic, Socrates, as the main character usually, asks questions of others and then tests the answers for coherence with each other and with the speaker's own character and actions. This process of dialectic is a kind of broader umbrella under which a particular early Socratic exercise of the elenchus or cross-examination is a very familiar and much debated species. Gregory Vlastos's article on the Socratic elenchus is a classic exploration of this issue, which you'll also see on screen. As Socrates asks questions and looks for coherence in the answers, and often in particular looks for definitions, there's usually some kind of central problem at hand. For instance, in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, the question is the nature and value of justice. In the Laches, it's the nature and value of courage. In the Phaedo, it's the immortality of the psyche. In the Ion, it is the nature of artistic inspiration. And incidentally, this little dialogue, the Ion, is a good one to underscore here because it doesn't get read a lot, but it helps, along with the Phaedrus, to give us a positive sense of Plato's view of inspired art. Ancient Greek commentators talk about this central problem, like the immortality of the psyche or what is justice, as the skopos or target of the work. And modern scholars in Anglophone literature especially talk about the what is F problem or search for definitions that is exercised by Socrates, particularly in a group or category of dialogues that are often thought to be early. But for now, it's maybe just important to stress that each dialogue has a particular focus, a skopos or a target or a scope, literally, that it is about. And Plato himself has Socrates in the dialogue The Phaedrus talk about the importance of this very kind of coherence, this sort of topical coherence and focus in a dialogue or a logos in any kind of written or spoken work like a speech. Throughout most of the dialogue, Socrates, again, is the central character, though there are a few exceptions, and in general, he's the one posing questions and testing the answers. And he usually is represented as disclaiming any personal expertise on each topic. It's perhaps important to note that in Plato, Socrates never says something in a blanket sense like, I know that I know nothing, which some later academic skeptics would point out would be self-refuting, but he does say things like, I know what I don't know. And he often claims not to know about the particular issue under discussion in the sense that he doesn't know the answers to his own questions and he is seeking wisdom. More on that in our episode on Socrates and his methods. It's worth noting here that there are a handful of dialogues like the Laws, the Timaeus, the Critias, the Sophist, the Statesman, and the Parmenides that put a different speaker in this kind of main questioning role. And the exceptions are often interesting. So in the dialogue called the Parmenides, for example, the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides, on whom we also have an episode, is the one asking questions, and the person giving the answers is a young teenage Socrates himself. So in this way, Plato frames Parmenides as a teacher of Socrates in his own method, and gives the Eleatic, that is, the style of philosophy associated with Parmenides, credit for this Socratic method. In other cases, we have a similar sort of teacher-student exercise where Socrates is in the student role, maybe the most memorable example is the prophetess Diotima in the Symposium, who Socrates represents as his teacher in matters of love and philosophy and the search for beauty. Again, as we mentioned before, it's rare that Plato will say anything about himself in a dialogue. In Apology 38a, he does mention that he's there in the courtroom speech that Socrates is giving. And in the Phaedo, he mentions that he's absent. Sometimes people think this is an interesting cue to how Plato wants us to read the dialogue. For example, that by mentioning his presence in the Apology, he wants us to think that he's an eyewitness and to give some more historical credence to the speech. Whereas in the Phaedo, by saying he's absent, he might want us to think of the conversation that ensues as a more creative literary fiction. But it's not clear that that's what he means because, again, he doesn't tell us in his own voice, and there's other interesting explanations for those mentions. Again, the main point in genre terms for us is maybe that he doesn't present himself as an important speaking character for the most part. There's a possible exception. Some have argued that the Athenian stranger in his final work, The Laws, could be a kind of spokesperson for himself, but again, that's not clear. And it is interesting to contrast at least many interpretations of Plato's student Aristotle's dialogues, like the Protrepticus. These are almost universally lost today, but when we attempt to reconstitute them, as for example, Doug Hutchinson and Monty Johnson have been doing with the Protrepticus as a Canadian effort, it's interesting to note that Aristotle seems to be a speaking character in his own dialogues. That's at least a good, plausible possibility. So Plato's taking himself out of the surface layer like this might be an interesting choice and not a given. Because of this, in any case, it's not clear which position or set of positions Plato's presenting himself as endorsing, but as we mentioned before, it's not uncommon for ancient and modern readers to just assume that whatever views are offered by the main character, often the one asking questions, and are not refuted in the dialogue, might reflect Plato's views when he wrote the text. It's interesting also to stress that this isn't just an abstract issue for Plato and his characters, because Socrates explicitly and repeatedly is portrayed as requiring every answer to his question to reflect a person's sincere beliefs if it's really going to help in the search for wisdom. And so it's not just a kind of dialectical game or exercise in winning an argument. Socrates presses this point again and again, that you have to say what you really believe, not what you think is going to be the best chess move on the argumentative board. This comes up, for example, in the Euthyphro 60, Gorgias 495a, Meno 80a, and Protagoras 334d. It's in a number of ways then that Socratic dialectic, this kind of practice of testing beliefs, differs from mere persuasive rhetoric, where the goal is just to persuade the audience of a position, or eristic competition, where the goal is to win an argument like a debate club. If you have to say what you really believe and your goal is to seek the truth, then it's Socratic dialectic. The dialogues as a whole fall into groups, and this is pretty broadly agreed in ancient and modern commentary or scholarship on Plato, although the nature of the groups is disputed and is rather different in antiquity and today. I'm going to use the modern contemporary way of breaking them down for clarity. So typically Plato's dialogues are divided today into three groups: early, middle, and late. But there's a slightly more complex division into early and transitional and middle and late, and you can get even more complicated than that. But let's use this fourfold division for now, and just tell the story as you'll often encounter it in modern scholarship on Plato. The early dialogues, which many think were composed between about 399 and 387, have a probing and exploratory character and are usually thought to be pretty similar to what the historical Socrates was up to. They're kind of comparable to the memories of Socrates' conversations we find in his contemporary Xenophon as well. And in these dialogues, we see Socrates asking questions, looking for definitions of moral terms like justice and courage, and not claiming to have answers. He often ends a dialogue in aporia, that is, without finding the answer, but in some ways presents this as a positive thing, that epistemic humility, knowing what we don't know, is a good and can help people. So some of the dialogues that fall into this category of early include the apology, that is the defense speech of Socrates, the Crito, which portrays a conversation in prison after he has been sentenced, the Charmides, the Laches, the Lysis, the Euthyphro, the Hippias Minor, the Ion, and the Protagoras. The next group of dialogues, the ones we'll call transitional, are sometimes thought to have been composed between around about 387 to 380. And there's seeds planted here of some ideas that scholars think are going to be Plato's main novel arguments and views in his prime, in the period of the Middle Dialogues. So this period where we start to see these seeds and we start to see them as kind of building on that early Socratic legacy include the Gorgias, the Meno, the Hippias Major, and the Cratylus. This is a small number of dialogues, so we can say a little about each of them. The Gorgias, looking into, among other things, the nature and value of rhetoric, and at the end, the nature of happiness. The Meno, which is a dialogue that has a lot of famous things to say about knowledge and virtue, but also introduces the possibility of what will be known as Plato's theory of recollection, the idea that all knowledge is really remembering what the soul or a psyche already knew. And the Hippias Major and the Cratylus. I'll just say briefly about the Cratylus that it is an important work in the philosophy of language, beginning to explore the question of whether naming or the use of terms to refer to things in the world is natural or merely a convention that's constructed. The next group of dialogues, the so-called Middle Dialogues, in this grouping, thought to be composed maybe roughly between 380 and 360. This is sort of the high period of original Platonic proposals in this way of breaking things down. And so here, on this view, we start to see Plato really innovating and brilliantly offering new ideas. Some of them very challenging, some of them questionable from a modern perspective, and also the perspective of many of his contemporaries, bridging all kinds of areas from metaphysics to the philosophy of science and language to aesthetics to moral psychology and the philosophy of religion, just about everything. So some classic examples here are the Phaedo, where the immortality of the soul is investigated, and this dialogue reflects a portrayal of Socrates' last day before his execution and his last conversation. The Symposium, an extended series of speeches on love. The Republic, which explores the nature of justice. And the Phaedrus, which explores the nature of love or eros again, as well as immortality and the nature of reality and the nature of speech and writing. So they're all tour de force works, and there's a lot of innovation and novelty that we find in this period. Probably what is most associated with this period is what we call today Plato's theory of forms, the idea that there are ideas, not ideas in the sense we usually use the word today, concepts, but real, eternal, unchanging patterns, analogous to the laws of physics and crossing boundaries between mathematics, aesthetics, morality, lots of other fields, but that the truth of the world is somehow present in eternal, unchanging patterns that we can access, so to speak, with the mind's eye, and that transcend what we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell in the world, which really, through the use of the senses and our ordinary perceptions and social assumptions and so on, all that we think is real is a kind of dream world that images and reflects this deeper set of patterns of eternity. So this idea that occurs in these middle dialogues is profoundly philosophically fruitful. It will challenge Plato's contemporaries and successors and be a huge impetus to the development of the philosophy of mathematics and the pursuit of the natural sciences, where looking for regularities and constant laws will become a really important and valuable thing to do in disciplines from astronomy to the future of chemistry and engineering, and in the theory of the arts and lots more. So all that cool stuff is going on in these middle dialogues. Then we get the last group, called the late dialogues, and this view may be composed between about 360 and 347. So here, Plato's seen to be taking a much more self-reflective line. He is testing some of the ideas that he's developed in the middle period. He's going deeper into them, and he's examining the assumptions and hypotheses of them like a good philosopher, raising questions for himself. And if you can imagine, at this point, Plato's surrounded by excellent philosophers in his academy, so he's having lots of good conversations about the ideas on this view that are developed and expanded and explored in the middle dialogues, and some of these exchanges are showing up in the late dialogues. So these dialogues are in character very meticulous, sometimes didactic, not so engaged with the dialogue form, though it's still formally respected, but a really close and precise examination of key issues. Some of them are metaphysical, that is to do with the nature of reality. Some of them are epistemological, to do with the nature of knowledge. Some of them are engaged with political and moral philosophy, but they all share this sort of tight, precise, didactic genre. So the examples include the Theaetetus, famous dialogue on the nature of knowledge, which includes the suggestion that knowledge might be justified true belief, but rejects that view at the end. The Parmenides, which studies the famous one of Parmenides. This is the dialogue where Socrates shows up as a student. The Sophist, the Statesman, the Philebus, the Timaeus, which was much more influential in much of antiquity than anything else Plato wrote. This epic work on cosmology that would have a profound influence on science, but also on the philosophy of religion, the idea of a kind of creative God who generates the material world, keeping an eye on Platonic forms or ideals as a model, like a painter looking back and forth between the ideal and the canvas. The Critias, and then the Laws. So that's, in a nutshell, one way of organizing the dialogues, a modern periodization of early, transitional, middle, and late, and it tells the story of Plato's development through his life. Now, it's important to stress we have no direct evidence for this periodization, but stylometry, that is the study through computers of statistical patterns in Plato, this does support a general kind of grouping along these lines. What it doesn't tell us is that it is a chronological grouping, that they have to go in this order. And so some have argued that the chronology can be sort of detached from the stylistic grouping. It's perfectly possible in this view that Plato, who is a master of styles and imitation, could, in his own later life, go back and write a so-called early Socratic dialogue perfectly well. And that the sort of soaring, epic, mythic register of some of the middle dialogues, he could also be writing at any time. So there's a great deal of deeper argument about that we might be able to come back to. But just to stress for now, the idea that these clusters are there stylistically and conceptually, doctrinally, that is, I think, pretty widely agreed. The fact that they're chronological, the argument that they're chronological, it's certainly a common argument, and it's the one that you would most usually encounter in an introduction to Plato, especially in an English scholarly context. But it's not as firm, and in fact there are strong arguments against a strict chronology. Still, it's broadly enough accepted that it's a pretty good way in to the story. A little note of kind of scholarly style and utility here. When you see Plato referenced, usually you'll see these alphanumeric numbers like Apology 38a. What this means is that in any translation of Plato or in the original Greek text, you can go to 38a in the margins to the left or right and find exactly the same block of text, even if it's a different translation or different language or different text. And the reason for this consistency is a Renaissance edition of Plato by Enricus Stephanus that was published in 1578, which all later editions harken back to. Something similar happens with Aristotle. So these alphanumeric numbers are called Stephanus numbers after Stephanus, who published the edition, and you'll see them all over the place. And they're really helpful because if you're looking at a public domain translation or a published one, or again, the Greek or even a Latin translation, you can find the same passage anywhere. Something else that might be worth saying about this clustering of Plato's works into groups. I mentioned before that the chronology is a broadly accepted modern view, but is not universally agreed, and that different ways of understanding the organization persisted in antiquity. A nice way to kind of give some philosophical weight to this clustering is to think about how Plato portrays Socrates as a philosophical ideal throughout these works. One way of putting this, I would argue at least, is that Plato offers us 4 Socrateses if you look at all the dialogues across all these clusters. And we find this rough scheme reflected in some modern scholarship, but also in ancient Greek commentary. On the one hand, you get the socially engaged gadfly of the city Socrates, and he's going around asking questions of people and trying to find out the nature of virtue and claiming not to have knowledge and encouraging people to cultivate answers in themselves to these questions of what virtues they really value and how they would understand them. This term gadfly of the city comes from Socrates himself in Plato's Apology. And you find this kind of representation in dialogues like the Apology or the Gorgias especially. In some dialogues, you find a focus more on a sort of ascetic Socrates who differentiates his soul from his body and focuses on the virtues of the soul rather than those of the body. The Phaedo is a really archetypal example of this, which makes sense, as some scholars like Zollert have argued, given its literary context in Socrates' last days. But this kind of ascetic Socrates, who is not at the service of his desires and aversions and is free of all social ambition and is truly free in the sense of being a pure luminous kind of agent of reason, this is a figure who has been inspiring in a different way than the socially engaged gadfly of the city and can also be found throughout the pages of Plato. A third kind of Socrates we find, for example, in the Theaetetus, in its famous philosophical digression about the philosopher's likeness to God, or in the Symposium, in the dialogue of love and the teaching of Diotima on rising to intelligible beauty, is Socrates as the ideal contemplative, the philosopher who is searching to know, and especially to know these eternal, unchanging patterns or forms that govern our aesthetic world as beauty and govern our moral world as the virtues like justice, and also governs the mathematical and scientific world. Socrates who aspires to know. And this Socrates can interact with these other 2 conceptions of the philosopher, or these other 2 ideals in some ways, because that ascetic practice we find in the Phaedo, for example, can help to be a contemplative. Socrates makes that argument in Plato's Phaedo that the soul alone by itself, using the mind's eye, is best positioned to see the patterns that the contemplative seeks, but they can also be distinguished. They can come apart. At least I would argue they can. And then there's a fourth kind of Socrates we occasionally see too, who the ancient commentators really care about, though he doesn't always get as much attention today, and this is the inspired Socrates experiencing frenzy, inspiration, especially in the arts and in love. The Phaedrus brings this out quite well, and moments in the dialogues when Socrates appears to be inspired by the muses or the nymphs or by another kind of divine presence. This is important to how Socrates frames his own identity, arguably, in the Apology, that he is someone open to the daimon who inspires him. But this is again different than the other 3 cases, or at least the accent is different. Socrates, with this kind of inspiration, may indeed seem to access the kind of knowledge that the contemplative seeks, but not in a sort of ascetic way. Often inspiration is much more embodied. Again, the idea of divine madness or divine frenzy in the Phaedrus that inspired later Renaissance readers like Ficino is really important to this conception. So all four of these are different enough that you might want to explain why Plato's philosophical ideal seems to change, and there's different ways of explaining this. So modern scholars will naturally focus on that chronology that we brought out and say, well, Plato's ideas changing over his life about what an ideal philosopher looks like. So he might start out really focusing on the socially engaged gadfly of the city in these so-called early dialogues and transitional dialogues, because that's pretty representative of what the historical Socrates was up to. But let's imagine as Plato gets into touch with more of these Pythagoreans, you can go back to our episode on the biographical tradition on Plato for this, and starts to explore more Heraclitean and Parmenidean ideas, we get these more ascetic and then contemplative pictures of the philosopher, and maybe Plato's contact with the mysteries, as some have argued, helps us understand his notion of the inspired or frenzied lover or artist as philosopher. So as Plato goes through his life, this is a very sort of modern, biographically inspired picture of how these different ideals might come about. The ancient commentators generally don't think of texts and authorship in that way, drawing on the norms of criticism developed by figures like Aristarchus in Alexandria, mostly critics of Homer. What they expect of an authoritative author like Plato is consistency, the set of ideas really when you start to write that are going to endure throughout your corpus. It's not to say you're always thinking exactly the same thoughts, but that the underlying framework of intuitions is going to be consistent and coherent, and you should be able to explain without inconsistency how one text sheds light on another. So this leads to different ways that modern and ancient readers handle these different ways of presenting the ideal philosopher typified by Socrates. In antiquity, the way it's presented is really as a sequence for reading. It's like Plato 101, Plato 201, Plato 301, and Plato 401. It's not about Plato's own change of views. It has to be that case that Plato had a relatively consistent set of intuitions, and it's you, the reader, who are learning how to build on one conception to go to the next. And the basic framework that especially ancient Neoplatonist commentators used to organize the Platonic dialogues in this way was called the scale of virtues. Scala virtutum in Latin, or bathmoi araton, the steps of excellences or virtues in Greek. And this is a notion that develops between the 3rd and 6th centuries CE. On this kind of picture, politicae arete, or the constitutional or civic kind of virtue that we develop by organizing our souls, reason, emotion, and desire into harmony and acting with a resulting harmony or justice outwardly, is entrained in us by studying what modern scholars usually talk about as the early and transitional dialogues, where we find the socially engaged Socrates. We learn to be a good person by balancing our motivations inwardly, again, balancing reason, spirited emotion, and desires. And in that way, we achieve inner harmony and an outward kind of justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance. Politicae is a great word here. It comes from the word polis for city, or also politeia for constitution, but along the lines of Plato's Republic, as the Neoplatonists in antiquity read him, the politeia, the polity or constitution here, is really fundamentally on the inside of the soul. It's about cultivating this kind of harmony between our ways of seeing and acting in the world that results in a more outward kind of virtue. So the language of polis can mean the city of the soul, which is quite lovely. So we build on that by reading these this sort of cluster of early dialogues, and then we can cultivate cathartike arete, from the word catharsis, which you might have come across in Aristotle, often translated purification, a sort of cleansing of the soul, which it corresponds roughly to that kind of ascetic outlook or mentality, where the focus is learning on the basis or groundwork of that politicae kind of ordinary sense of virtue, now turning to see how we can cultivate a more focused and consistent consciousness of the soul apart from all the distractions of desires and aversions and fears and worries and all the stuff that might interrupt us, to train the eye of our soul on anything we really want to understand with concentration, discipline, and a kind of mindfulness, we might say, today. So this kind of cathartic approach builds on politicae arte because you need this sort of harmony of the soul at the starting point to achieve the kind of tranquility and consistency of mind that allows you to engage in this catharsis. And reading dialogues like the Phaedo can help you. It's not an end in itself, but it helps with a step. Next, having achieved that, or built at least a reasonable groundwork of a capacity to focus, you can turn your mind to theoreticae arte. This is from the word theoria, which means literally witnessing. It's where we get words like theory in English, but this is about contemplation, how we see and understand the patterns or the forms of reality in the world. And here, it helps us to read dialogues like the Theaetetus and the Symposium, and of course, this is also where we're going to meet the Platonic forms worked out in detail, or these eternal non-contingent patterns, because now the eye of our mind, trained by catharsis, grounded in politicae arte, is ready to perceive them. And it's with that in the background that we're also able to work in a healthy way with inspiration, frenzy, and divine mania. The kind of inspired Socrates that we meet in the Phaedrus can come into focus as a sort of a further step of human goodness. And there's two ways of conceiving this notion. One is as a kind of capstone after the other kinds of arete, and another is as a different parallel path, a different way to cultivate the goodness of our soul through a receptivity to inspiration, like the poet being open to the muses or the dancer to the dance. This could be another way to develop this kind of level of inspiration and self-development. So on that kind of picture, the sequence of stylistic clusters in the dialogues, very loosely, could be a little bit different, but along these lines, can help us as a pedagogical sequence rather than a chronological one. Now, on the other hand, we can compare this to the scholarly periodization of the dialogues. Roughly, politicae arte, a lot of this, the dialogues that the ancient Platonists put into this category are the early Socratic dialogues, and they roughly correspond, again, between what modern scholars put in that chronological sequence and what ancient commentators put in the sequence of teaching politicae arte. The dialogues that are early, middle, or transitional roughly correspond, though not only, to what the Neoplatonists put in the category of catharticae arte. There's lots of overlap here, so I don't want to be too schematic, but it's kind of a nice way to think about how the ancient and modern scholars might talk to each other. What the ancients call theoreticae arte, the dialogues that teach contemplative virtue, bridge what modern scholars talk about as middle and late period Plato. And it's not really the case that the inspired stuff corresponds to a periodization in the modern sense. There's not like a set or of dialogues or a period where Plato was thought to be particularly interested in this, but it's still, I think, helpful to compare the two categories. So very roughly, even though it doesn't work in any way with precision, you can say that the early Socratic dialogues roughly correspond to the issues that ancient commentators put in the politicae arte group, and lots of the early middle transitional dialogues and the Phaedo can be seen as relating to catharticae arte, and a lot of the middle and late stuff to theoreticae arte. At least I think that's a nice idea to think with if you want to put the two traditions into dialogue. So, last but not least, we can just mention some of the kinds of questions that Plato explores throughout these works. In the next episodes, we're going to look more at some of Plato's ideas and try to get a broad overview of the philosophy, but you might remember the famous quote by Whitehead in Process and Reality about philosophy in the European tradition being a kind of series of footnotes to Plato, not because of the answers that he gives, but because of the questions that he raises. And these are just some samples. What's the nature of reality? We find this in lots of dialogues like the Republic and Parmenides. What is knowledge, and how do we obtain it? For example, in the Theaetetus. What is justice, and how can it be achieved in the individual psyche and in collective practice? For example, in the Republic and Laws. What is the nature of a human person or psychology in the Phaedo and Phaedrus? What are the processes that led to the development of the cosmos in the Timaeus? Why is mathematics so effective in describing natural processes in the Timaeus or the Meno? What are the basic elements and laws of the natural world in the Timaeus? What is the relationship between the appearance of constant change and the appearance of some permanence or consistency in our world? For example, in the Parmenides and Cratylus. What is beauty? What is love in the Symposium and the Phaedrus? What is the role of education and art in society, in the Republic, especially in books 2 to 10? What differentiates merely imitative or mimetic art, like reality television, on the one hand, from truly inspired art, if there is such a thing, which Plato clearly, through his characters, seems to think there is, for example, in the Ion and the Phaedrus? Or what is immortal in humanity and what is mortal in humanity? What is really immortal in us in the Phaedo? So that takes us through a brief exploration of some themes in Plato's dialogues and some different ways of organizing the works. And next we'll talk about some of Plato's own key ideas. No son